All right, so thanks everybody again for joining today. We have two well-known members of the community who are going to talk a little bit about a couple of ongoing projects that they're working on. We have Brenna Mead and Ed Moynihan, both from Indiana University's International Networks team and EPIC, and they're going to be talking a little bit about the GNA-G Routing Working Group and some general investigation and troubleshooting and ways that they've been working to try to improve performance for both routing and other use cases on the networks. So I believe Ed is going to kick us off. So Ed, if you'd like to share. Oops, I'm only seeing an eighth of your screen, Ed. There we go.
How about that? Yep, just getting there.
Yep, there we go. Okay. I'll throw it over to you, Ed.
All right, thanks, Jason. Yeah, Ed Moynihan here from Indiana University and EPIC, speaking today with Brenna Mead about using NetSage and the GNA-G Routing Working Group to investigate, troubleshoot, and improve network performance. Glad to see some familiar names in the participant list here. Thanks everybody for coming, and thanks to Jason for the opportunity to speak today. I'm assuming everyone is here voluntarily and at least has some interest in the topic. If we get out ahead of ourselves with some of the acronyms or names or anything that people aren't understanding, feel free to put the question in the chat box and somebody will respond. Otherwise, I believe we're holding all questions until the end. I think we'll talk maybe 30 or 40 minutes and then have 15 minutes or so at the end to address any specific questions. So as Jason said, we're talking about NetSage and the GNA-G Routing Working Group today, but I'll give a little overview of the talk before we jump right into it. So the agenda, we'll look at what we mean by science engagement, what NetSage has done to help us evolve our proactive engagements, run through a few examples, and then I'll hand it over to Brenna to talk about the GNA, the routing working group, some use cases there, and then how our community can become more involved in both projects. So with that, who are we? We're the International Networks team at Indiana University. We're formerly based in Bloomington, although many of us are spread around the country and the world. We're directed by Dr. Jen Schopf. We partner closely with many organizations, but here at IU with the Global NOC and with ESNet. Most importantly, we're part of the larger global research and education community, and I'll try to drive that point home today in the talk, is that a lot of the work that we do to try to improve network performance for US science is entirely dependent upon that community and partnerships and relationships with other organizations. And needless to say, primarily funded by the NSF, the IRNC program. But we're just not operating circuits. We have other research focus areas, including, as I said, collaborations and relationship building, but circuit usage, improving performance for scientists and other things that we'll talk about. So our first project here is TransPAC, which has been in its 5th iteration and has been around for over 20 years. Currently funded recently TransPAC 5, which is supporting 100 gig RNE circuit between Seattle and Tokyo. And soon we'll be supporting 100 gig circuit as part of a consortium of other members of the community between Guam and Singapore. TransPAC is part of the APONET consortium, which is a relatively new group of RNA networking organizations in the Asia Pacific area that have come together to provide diversity, redundancy, backups across the Pacific. Our second main project currently is NEAR, or NEAR 3, Networks for European, American, African, and Arctic Research. So this is facing the other direction towards Europe. It supports 200 gig circuits between the US and Europe, one New York to London, and one New York to Amsterdam via Copenhagen, and Like the APONET in the Pacific, we're part of a larger consortium in the Atlantic called the ANA, the Advanced North Atlantic, which currently has 9 100 gig circuits, providing backup and redundancy, which has come in handy in the past couple of weeks due to some cable cuts in the Atlantic. Traffic has seamlessly flowed over to some of the other circuits. But we're more than a network. We provide services to the community, services that we kind of put under the larger heading of engagement. The idea of science engagement or research engagement or end user engagement is relatively new in our community. So as a formal practice, it's pioneered by ESNet in the US, and other organizations have kind of come up behind ESNet's efforts there. Globally, NRENs and other RNE networking organizations have resources committed to what we call engagement. GEANT in Europe, SURF, DFN, other of the larger NRENs have specific staff working on engagement. But when you get into other areas of the world, Asia and Africa, the idea of engaging with end users to improve performance, to understand networks, to do things on top of just operating the networks is kind of a foreign concept. And so I'd like to take a little bit of time and talk about exactly what we mean by engagement or what it means around the world. I've listed a few of the bullets here. Primarily understanding network usage and performance, and working to try to understand the workflow of your users, and understanding what methods and tools and technologies can be put in place to improve performance. Let's sort of clump those into one category of engagement, but the other category of engagement is more around sustainability and promoting best practices. So there's REN advocacy. So a lot of NRENs around the world aren't as established as those in the US, and need help from the larger community, promoting the value of RNE networks and promoting best practices. Business development also, this is reaching out to users who are, or science projects or collaborations that aren't using RNE resources, and finding them and promoting the value. Under this heading, I think there's sort of membership retainment as well. So engagement, not of science for improvement of performance, but to increase the number of users of the network, or to maintain the current user base. Relationship building and management is relatively obvious. We attend a lot of science meetings, for example, to maintain visibility in those communities. And finding the ability to articulate what you're doing, the work that you're doing, to your funding agencies specifically, or to others, is a real skill that some network engineers, let's say, or other network operators might not have. And it's extremely important to be able to kind of combine all of these things into what we call engagement. So traditionally, how our team has done this is via partner relationships within the projects, by being visible in the science communities. For example, LHC1 or ESUP, other larger science communities, is just being there, letting them know, and advocating on behalf of our community. In some of our previous awards, we had funding directly for education and training, so Perf-Sonar training, to help promote the tools that allow for integration and collaboration around our community. We've tried mining NSF and NIH project databases to find potential collaborators who are sharing large amounts of data around the world, and reaching out to them and trying to understand their science and workflow better. And we followed the lead of other partners on other projects and other sources in a much more reactive way, responding to requests, waiting for people to come to us. And I provide all that background to jump into what NetSage has allowed us to do, is to become a lot more proactive in our engagements, and to give us a starting off point for not just understanding the network, but for working globally to help improve the end-to-end performance for large data flows. And if you've not come across NetSage before, this slide provides an introduction simply to what it is. It's an advanced measurement service for R&E data. It helps us understand performance, volume, traffic patterns, etc. Originally funded out of the IRNC program, collaboration between IU, LBNL, and Hawaii. It's now expanded. It's being deployed with partners within EPIC, other international partners, in conjunction with the global NOC. I'm not going to do a live demo, but it is public, and if you go to the link there, you can play around with it. So again, how has NetSage allowed us to be more proactive in our end user engagement? So NetSage essentially allows our partners to share SNMP and de-identified flow data, which allows us to identify top talkers, to tag flows as coming from specific projects or science domains. It allows us to look at changes in volume, changes in rate, to compare these over time. It allows us to look at routing to get a sense, hints into how things are routed around the world. And all of this together serves as a starting point for end-to-end performance debugging. So it gives us the initial insight into potential problems, and then allows us to go off and work with our partners in EPIC, our partners around the world, to get a better sense of how the infrastructure is being used, and then gives us opportunities as they exist to work together to help improve that performance. So it's allowed us, again, to be much more proactive in our end user engagement efforts. I'm going to run through a couple of use cases here. This is a screenshot from NetSage. It shows you there on the left a list of some of the questions you can ask to NetSage. So you can see current state of the network, top sources and destinations, flow pairs, flows by country, etc. But I'll jump into an example here to give you a sense of how we're using NetSage to improve performance. And this is a great example that came as we were continuing to develop NetSage, and the COVID-19 pandemic hit, and we were forced to, I think a lot of the engagement activities that I outlined before rely on, to some extent, face-to-face interaction, or the ability to travel to conferences, or a lot of face-to-face engagement with funders, for example, or partners, or with scientists. But of course, COVID prevents that from happening. And so we had to adapt our engagement efforts. And again, NetSage allowed us to do that. And this, I think, is one of the better examples from that time period. We noticed January to March of 2020, a relatively dramatic increase in traffic from the UK to the US. And you can see that here in the screenshot. The sensor is our New York to London circuit. The time period here in the upper right is January 1 to the end of March. And we see that JISC, the UK NREN, is our top source. And so that gives us a hint that something new is happening here, something's going on, they're moving a lot of data. So then we dig down deeper into that, and we can look for specific organizations. There's sort of a step that I skipped here, which is you can look at all flows to and from JISC as a source. I've broken it down here because we were able to identify the source in the UK as being the European Bioinformatics Institute, or EBI, and the destination being Partners Healthcare System, a consortium of hospitals run by MIT and Harvard in Boston. And you see here that we don't have any visibility down below JISC as an organization, but digging down, doing some research, who is searching the web, we can make a pretty good guess at what the endpoints are behind JISC, and then work with our partners to further understand who's moving that data. But you see here an increase from, I think it's 1 terabit in the entire year of 2019 to almost 70 between January 1st and March of 2020. with a average transfer rate of 43 megs, which is not what we'd expect. So what does NetSage allow us to see? It allows us to go back in time and see how much data was being moved prior to this increase. It allows us to document how much we're seeing in this period, in this quarter, and then gives us a sense of the data transfer rates. So what we're seeing is less than 50 megs overall on average, with significant variance up to 400 and down to 5. And knowing what we know about that network path, obviously we operate 100 gig link transatlantic, but we know that JISC has 100 gig up to the border for EBI, and likely on the US side, also at least a 10 gig path end to end. So these rates are significantly lower than what we would expect. So what do we do about it? And this is where it becomes a real challenge from my perspective and becomes a true global effort. So we reach out to our partners, our near partners at GNA, who have contacts at their member organization, JISC. JISC obviously has EBI as a member. They go down that chain and put us in touch with technical contacts at EBI. And through our contacts in the US side, Jason and others at Epic and other people in our community get us in touch with the Knox and with folks at MIT to find the right contacts on that side. Our team then works to bring together the engineers from both sides and start running some tests, sonar tests, trace routes, to see if we can identify the problem. And at that point, we utilize our partnership with Epic to, once we have the engineers engaged, we hand it over to Epic, who then works towards a resolution of the issue that we've identified. And I can provide a little bit of summary of what happened. So it turned out that EBI, with the massive increase in traffic, had overloaded their firewall and had and their load balancer. And so with a few slight internal adjustments, adjustments that they weren't necessarily willing to describe to us in detail for, I'm assuming, security purposes, we were able to notice an increase, 100% increase in the average transfer rate on flow. So this is a screenshot from a year later, the same time frame. We're seeing from below 50 meg to above 100 meg with simple adjustments, but it's simple technical adjustments. But the path to get here from the initial inquiry involves a lot of parties, a lot of work, and a lot of resources. So that's an example of NetSage showing us performance, providing us with opportunities to look at performance and to fix international performance. Another example of what NetSage can do is give us hints at potential routing anomalies. And so I've pulled this screenshot from the flow data dashboard within NetSage. And what we're seeing here is flows across sensors in the US from international sites to international sites. So if we go through some of these, we see Academia Sinica, which is Taiwan, to Australia, which we're seeing showing up in the US. We're seeing, let's see, China to Saudi Arabia, which may or may not be an issue. But then we're seeing here, this is Saudi Arabia to Saudi Arabia via New York, which from a routing perspective can't be good. So it gives us these insights into potential routing problems that could be solved to help improve performance. But in some ways, that's not enough. What do we do once we've identified these potential issues? And so NetSage allows us to identify. The outreach and other engagement allows us to do partner outreach or end user outreach or engineering outreach. But there are some issues still that we're working through and that we're researching best practices on to address a few issues that I've outlined here. One, of course, this is difficult to scale across hundreds of them, and determining how to prioritize those and which will bring us the most value is difficult to do given limited resources we have. Incentives to engage are sometimes unaligned. So for example, engineers don't like to be told that their networks aren't performing well. And oftentimes we'll reach out, we'll identify an issue, we'll be ignored for a month, and then we'll go back and run the tests, and voila, everything's fixed. So there's often unaligned incentives for engagement. And then finally, it's a massive commitment of resources across multiple domains. In the example of EBI, we're using the time of engineers or engagement folks at GEANT, engineers at EBI, at Knox, at MIT, on our team at Epic. And so it's a large commitment of resources towards what some people might see as minor fixes, but which ends up being, our main mission is to make sure that scientists have the performance that they expect across the networks that we're operating. And so finally, and this is sort of my transition slide, is that it takes global collaboration. Resolution of these problems requires global collaboration and global commitment. And so we're working and leading in this space, multiple efforts to help address some of these issues. And with that, I'll hand it over to Brenna, who will talk about a new initiative within the GNAG and some of the work we're doing there. Brenna, I'll stop sharing.
Okay, just a moment. Can everyone see my screen?
Yep, you're good.
Great. Hi, as Ed said, my name is Brenna Mead. I work with the team here at Epic and International Networks at Indiana University. It's really nice to see a few of you. I know quite a few people on this call. So I wanted to start with the problem that Ed proposed is that, how do we create a community to work on these issues together? And how do we incentivize these communities? And how do we collaborate together? And that is the goal of the GNA-G Routing Working Group, which I will talk about in a moment. But I want to give you guys an overview first of what the GNA-G is. The GNA-G is the Global Network Advancement Group. It is the forum for coordinated global collaboration for RNA networking. And so they are not just working on routing. There's several active working groups. As I have listed here, mapping, data intensive science, automation, and especially important to me is the routing working group. If you all want more information, I recommend you go to the website. There is a ton of resources there and interesting projects that other groups are working on. What is the GNA-G International Routing Working Group? This was established to create a community to work on international routing issues and improve RNA performance. The goal of this is to engage those network owners and those NRENs to not only be reacting to issues and reacting to ineffective routes, but trying to work proactively and create a collaborative community to not just fix these problems, but create policies to prevent them from occurring and just create better relationships for when we see these problems. So the co-chairs are myself, Brenna Mead, Warwick Mitchell from ARNet, and then Hans Adelman. We've had a few meetings. We've just started in June here, became official in June. So we've had a couple sessions. I just want to touch on some of the tools that we've talked about in our sessions. We had a route views talk, which was great, which was a great resource for those network engineers that want to peek into some network issues that are not your networks. It's all read only. Then we had a presentation by Dr. Jennifer Schupp, and that was also on NetSage, very similar to what Ed just went over, and very similar to the presentation that you'll see next week if you come from Doug. And then we had the Routing Working Group's cases update, which was just an overview of some of the cases that we're working on. I'm actually going to go over some of those cases here today. And then just last month, we had a manners talk from Steve Wallace, and that was incredibly beneficial. We had some great discussion come out of that talk. And, you know, these talks are meant to just give us some resources and give us some ideas for how to collaborate with each other. Currently, we have 128 members on the routing working group list. I wanted to highlight that we have 23 countries represented and 97 institutions represented right now. That can only go up, hopefully, and we're excited to continue to have more people added to the list and more institutions and more countries represented, because the more institutions that want to collaborate with us and be in this community, the better the overall community will be. So currently we have 9 cases and we have solved 3 of them. Today I'm going to go over 2 that we've solved and give you guys an opportunity to ask questions about those, and also give anyone an opportunity to reach out if they are having routing issues and get some contact information to join the routing working group. Let's talk about some challenges that we see in international routing. So one of the prevalent ones is asymmetrical routing, meaning that the source and destination, the source to a destination takes one path one way, and the other way it takes a completely different path. Often there's reasons for that. However, usually it's more efficient to be symmetrical in your routing. Another issue is that RNE data takes a less efficient route around the world, which can affect performance. For example, some of the things that we look at in the routing working group is Europe to Asia routes traversing the US, Africa to Europe routes traversing the US. Those are things that we are trying to identify and work on through the routing working group. Another issue is that the RNE data is taking a commodity route versus an RNE path. And those of you that have been that are RNE network engineers know that there's a variety of issues on commodity routes, often MTU issues, just a variety of things that can cause performance issues on commodity routes, and RNE paths should be preferred. One final issue that we're trying to work on through this group is as you all know, RNE links are coming up and being removed every day. They're changing scale. They're going from 1 gig to 10 gig to 100 gig to, and sometimes when those physical connections come up, the routing doesn't adjust appropriately or doesn't adjust the way that you think it's going to adjust. So sometimes we end up with these routing anomalies because a new route has happened or a route was removed. So those are things that we are also on the lookout for. So the GNA-G Routing Working Group is intended to find a better way to address these for the community, not just for us at International Networks, but for everyone in the RNE community across the world. So again, some resources that we use within the Routing Working Group to identify these issues and try to troubleshoot them and fix them. NetSage, as Ed went over, that gives you quick access to SNMP and flow and route information. It's easy to find data rate and volume issues, and there are valuable insights to how traffic is being routed in NetSage. And then from NetSage, you can go to Perf Sonar and do trace routes and throughput tests and determine what route that data is actually taking and what the performance is on that route. The other one I've mentioned is route views peering, and then router proxy or looking glass. So those are some of the tools that we use to identify these issues, troubleshoot within the routing working group teams that I will talk about. So the first case I'm going to talk about is the Singapore to Taiwan. So through the routing working group using NetSage, we identified asymmetric routing and traffic Asia to Asia that was traversing the US. So I will be going through how we fixed that, but the solution was we did fix the asymmetrical routing. The traffic is no longer traversing the US via CERN, LA, and the round trip time has dropped from 290 milliseconds to about 50. That changes occasionally, but that's a pretty decent metric for the performance improvement that we saw. The team that we worked with here, myself, Simon Green from CERN, and then Eric Yen and Wen Shu Chen from Taiwan. So the goal of these mini teams is to identify engineers that can help you with these issues, identify the engineers that care and want to work with you and get these problems resolved. So this is how we identified it in NetSage. Earlier, Ed showed you the country-to-country flows. So I was looking at Singapore to Taiwan. And one of the things you can do is scroll down and see what sensors that data is being seen on. So as you can see, traffic going from Singapore to Taiwan was using both CERN that is local to Singapore and that Asia area. And then there's also CERN LA, which goes across the entire United States and then back over to Taiwan. So I wanted to investigate this within the routing working group, and we brought it to the routing working group and identified our team. To start, we took a look at some perf sonar tests just to confirm that what we were seeing in NetSage was what was actually happening. And these perf sonar tests did show us that. As you can see, Taiwan to Singapore takes a significantly longer route, traverses the US via internet 2. And the way Singapore to Taiwan, the other way does not traverse the US and is a much shorter path, staying in the APAN region and the CERN networks. So the goal here was to fix this and sort of make these perf sonar tests look more symmetrical. As this is the perf sonar test after working with the routing working group, we spent about 2 weeks with that mini team working to address this issue specifically. I would also like to thank the members of this team. They were very responsive. I don't believe any of them are on this call, but it was an incredibly good experience to work with this team. So as you can see, now we have the same amount of hops. We have much better times in terms of milliseconds, and the routing just looks better. As you can see, it doesn't leave the APAN CERN region. So we were really excited that we fixed this issue. And as a result of this routing working group, I have a great new experiences with these engineers from Taiwan and from CERN. So that's the first case that we have solved. The second one I want to talk about is an interesting one because the solution to this one was that it is already the best path, which is something that happens in the R&E community. There's reasons that the traffic is taking the path that it's taking, whether it be political issues on other circuits, just a variety of things can cause this problem. And that is what happened with this case. So again, using NetSage, we noticed traffic from CERN to KISTI over the near router in New York. So I reached out to Dale Carter at ESNet, Eduardo Martelli at CERN, and Buseng Cho at KISTI, and created yet another mini routing working group team. And we took a look at this because it does seem strange. Why would you go from Switzerland to South Korea over New York? So we took a look at this, and it was determined in the end that this is actually the best path right now because CreoNet 2, the direct circuit between Amsterdam and Chicago, is congested. So they are in the process of upgrading CreoNet 2 to 100 gig. And we're hoping that will improve the path, but that's yet to be determined. And we also have to be careful with, as I mentioned earlier, when new paths are added, we need to make sure that the routing is correct and that the link is actually being used. So this will be something that we may want to come back to after this has been fixed and work with this team again and confirm that the issues that we saw it is now taking the correct route. And again, I want to thank those who worked with us on this case. This was another 2-3 week engagement, and it was very interesting to see how we went through and determined that this was the correct route, even though it doesn't seem like it should be. This is just the NetSage. This is how we discovered it. So we have our source organization, CERN, then we have our destination organization and our sensors. Our sensors there are the New York, London, and the Amsterdam circuits. So as you can see, it's not a huge amount of traffic. The rates are pretty good. So we're not incredibly concerned about this one, but it was interesting to see one of those cases where it ended up that this was the correct route, and that'll happen. But it's something to note again for when they do increase that up to 100 gig. What are the next steps in the routing working group to make sure that that link is being used effectively, and that all the routing changes that happened went through the system correctly. I'm sure all of you are wondering, because you want to come with me and get involved with the routing working group, how to be involved. So we meet the second Tuesday of every month. There will be no November meetings, but there is an October meeting, October 12th, 8 a.m. Eastern time, 12 p.m. UTC. That will be on Router Proxy Looking Glass. And I will also be going over some of the cases that we still have that are in progress. So if you want to be added to the routing working group list, just let me know. You can put it in chat here. You can send me an email. There's a variety of ways of getting a hold of me, and I will add you then to the APAN Slack instance and the channel for routing. And if you want to check out more information on the GNA-G Routing Working Group, please just go to that link, and and there's a ton of information about it, or you can contact any of the co-chairs, myself, Hans, or Warwick, if you know any of them. Looks like we've hit our time for questions. Please feel free to ask any questions, and thank you for your time.
All right, well, thank you, Brenna and Ed. So a reminder, if anybody does have any questions, please type them into the chat room and we can replay them. I've jotted down a couple here just to get us started. So far, within the collaboration of the working group, what would you say is the most common either complaint or criticism that people are bringing forward that need to be sort of worked on as a community?
That's a great question, Jason. I think one of the main complaints that, again, the routing working group is trying to solve is who do we contact? For example, Ed, he brought up the routing issue where we're seeing traffic from Saudi Arabia to Saudi Arabia in New York. And, logically, that doesn't seem right, and it isn't. And the hardest part of that case, which I've actually started to engage that team, is who do we work with? Who are these contacts? How do we get these people involved? How do we get them incentivized to join the routing working group, to work with us? So I think for me, that's the biggest challenge within the routing working group, is getting the correct players to come to the meetings and get involved, and to see these issues as something we should all be working on.
All right, thanks, Brenna. Miriam has a question. So this is more of a future-facing question, she says. Is NetSage going to be releasing APIs such that we can access the data or write Jupyter notebooks, code processing the data NetSage is collecting?
Yeah, so this is Ed. I think that's probably a question better addressed to the NetSage team. I don't know if Jen is on the call, if she wants to address that.
Oh, yep, I do see Jen. So Jen, hopefully your dogs are not howling. I am going to make you a co-host and you can unmute yourself.
Great, thank you. I was just asking if someone could unmute me. So I don't know what you mean by releasing APIs. So NetSage doesn't own the data. So if you want raw access to that data, it's a bigger process than just giving you an API. Miriam, I think you had been talking about post-processing data at one point in time, and we can work with you to do that. But if you mean in terms of like live data, that's not part of the user agreement we have for the data sources right now, and it's not clear that that would be useful to you for doing what you're trying to do now. The next talk next week is on NetSage though, and we can get into that in more detail. I think one of the really fascinating things about NetSage and the routing working group is because NetSage gives you this higher level view between different administrative domains, it can find the routing problems that people just didn't even know were there. We see we see traffic going through countries that it just shouldn't on a regular basis, or because we have most of our routers timed with a geolocation. So for example, our international links in New York, we should never see Europe to Europe traffic going through New York, but we do all the time. That's in part how NetSage is being used in this context.
All right, thanks, Jen, for addressing that one. I think we are out of questions in the chat room right now, so I'll put out another call. If anybody does have any others they want to ask, please speak up. So I'll throw in another one here. At least in terms of structured group activities that you're going to be doing within the working group, is there anything that you're going to push out in terms of recommendations? You know, for instance, like a best practice for a regional or for an exchange point or for a backbone network in ways that they can make it easier for either others to be able to find information or expose monitoring data or whatever. You know, maybe this is just working with route views, maybe it's doing something else. Is there any sort of appetite for that or ways that you're going to be working towards publishing something of that nature?
Yes, currently, I believe for me, I think the goal is to get as much of the community that we want in the routing working group, and then we do want to go forth and start working on best practices, talking about communities. And I believe Hans may have a better answer for this question as my co-chair. Do you have anything you'd like to add?
Oh, let me.
Yep, I got it.
Hans,
or you got it. Someone got it. Yeah. So
I got it.
One of the thanks. One of the things that we've been talking about in the routing working group on the list recently was an idea from our friends at CERF. Peter thought it would be a really good idea to help direct traffic and kind of give an idea where traffic's coming from, whether it be a state, a country, R&E, commodity, whatever, for the routing working group to publish some well-known communities, you know, BGP communities for other networks to queue off of. One of our first cases was from SurfNet to Africa, and Peter put a pretty good example out showing, hey, if we had these communities documented somewhere, we could have really easily fixed this. So that's something we're looking at putting on our website, and I'm sure there will be other best practices, but you know, if you have ideas like that, please join the list. It's wide open. Let's talk about it.
All right, thank you, Hans. And I didn't even have to force him to ask a question, but I knew he had one. Matt Zakauskas wants to know if you can provide some details about how some of the problems have been fixed. You know, for example, the first one, you mentioned getting together, investigating, and fixing, but he didn't hear what the actual fix was. Was it just adjusting the routing announcements or preventing someone from leaking a route or sending a more specific route in some direction? You don't need to name specific people, but if you want to go into detail here, this is the crowd that likes that geeky information.
Yes. So essentially, you know, they can be a little bit cagey when you work with some of these engineers, but essentially they just adjusted the prefixes so that it was, you know, changing the default route essentially. So and the SERP issue was also a local prefix issue. So a lot of these are just going in and adjusting the prefixes so that you're using the correct route instead of whatever it is automatically chosen. So the two cases that we've worked on have been routing adjustments, prefix changes. So that's what we're running into right now.
I'll add in, sometimes these things get fixed and we don't know who's changed what. Brenna mentioned this, but we see this more often than you would believe, that people just don't want to admit that something was set up incorrectly, and so they just don't. And you know, we'll say, hey, can you help with this? And they'll say something like, oh, it looks like it's fine. I don't know what problem you're talking about, because they've changed something. And our hands are kind of tied with that, where we know something changed, but don't know what. We even had, in one case that wasn't actually routing related, we had a piece of equipment that on a campus we had identified as going bad. And we said, can you tell us what the equipment is? And they're like, no, we can't, it's a security risk. Like, okay, that's really strange. So the social political pieces of this are very strange at times. So thank you, Matt.
And Matt is not done. He has more. With the manners talk, was there any thought about adding intent into a routing DB?
Yes, there's been a little bit of talk about that. I want to circle back on that. But we have had some discussion about RowdyDB, and but yeah, I need to circle back with that group about, you know, how we want to do that. What's the best way to advertise that? Matt, I think you should join the routing working group.
Sounds like Matt's going to be forcibly added to the routing working group. Well, so I'll put out the call since Hans opened the door there. If there is anybody who's still on the line here and wants to be added, pop your name into the chat room, or send something off to Brenna and Ed, and you can certainly get plugged into that community. As we've all heard from multiple talks this year, you know, these problems are going away, and yes, another working group is another working group, but if there's a lot of people that are starting to get together and pushing forward some of these best practices, I think that it has a higher chance of being successful in trying to stomp down some of these problems. All right, I don't see any other things in the chat right now, but I'll put out one last call. If anybody has anything, I'll thank Brenna and Ed one more time. If you guys want to make sure you send me a copy of the slides, I'll get those posted. And to continue the theme of people from IU giving talks, next week is going to be Doug Southworth, and he is going to be talking about NetSage in a little bit more detail, talking a little bit about the framework itself, how you use it, how it can be installed, and some of the problems that have been found and corrected with the deployments that we have on some of your networks that are out there. So if anybody does have interest in that, please join us next week. And I will check the chat one more time. All right,
Jason, I've got a shameless plug to end things here with.
Absolutely, we love shameless plugs.
We currently have a job opening in our team to work on some of these issues. Very exciting opportunity. So if anybody on this call is interested or knows somebody who might potentially be interested in joining our team, have them contact us and get in touch.
All right. Well, thank you, Ed, and thank you, Brenna. And so we will get the video posted of this, and hope everybody has a good weekend, and we'll talk to everybody next week. Thanks all.
Thanks.